Hello, everyone. My name is Maggie Vandenberg with the IQ Business Group. I'm happy to be your moderator for today's webinar, Preservation of Information, Retention's Big Brother. I'm joined today by Ryan Britton, Vice President of Delivery from Mint, Jay Hall, Channel Solution Engineer from AvePoint, and Brian Vanette, Solution Engineering Manager from AvePoint. We are proud to sponsor today's webinar to support our public and private sector folks, including Fed, SLED, and our private sector friends seeking knowledge and insight for leveraging a successful Microsoft 365 preservation strategy. For folks who have joined us before, thanks for joining us again. And for those we haven't had the pleasure of meeting before, welcome. IQBG is a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the public sector and highly regulated industries. Since 2008, the IQ Business Group has been developing ECRM and content services solutions for highly regulated industries, including public and private sectors, that leverage people, process, and technology to support your requirements.
Hello, everybody. Hey, Maggie, Jay, and Brian. Welcome to another webinar. My name is Ryan Britton. As Maggie said, I work for an organization called the Mint Group, which is a global Microsoft partner with 20 years of experience implementing Microsoft solutions. You can see from the slide that we're very present in highly regulated industries as well. We have a few awards under our belt, and we have a long list of Microsoft Gold competencies that we take into every engagement.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jay Hall, and I'm the Channel Solution Engineer here for AvePoint. We, again, are also plus 20 years of experience with regards to managing, migrating, and protecting data in M365. We are the largest ISV in the M365 workspace regarding research and development for Microsoft outside of Microsoft themselves. Just like you heard before, we touch upon all different types of industries and verticals, including being FedRAMP authorized for backup solutions, as well as being a 5 times Partner of the Year award winner from Microsoft.
Fantastic. And so the methodology that brings us here today, and the reason why we have these webinars talking about different topical things that are relevant in the space of information governance and compliance, is because of an effort that we support called Smart Compliance, which is essentially a bucket of these disciplines and all of the interrelated and ancillary kind of things that you would want to get right when looking at an information governance and compliance strategy. You can go to the next slide, please, Maggie. And essentially, this complicated mandala is representative of the different things that can go into these types of strategies. And I'm sure you would agree that getting this right while migrating to the cloud, while adopting new technologies, while dealing with the ever-changing landscape of compliance and regulation can be quite difficult. There's a lot that goes on here, and every organization is different. Every organization has different requirements. And one of those requirements is usually something to do with preservation, something that has been the purview of the federal space for a while, usually to do with longer term records, and certainly something worth touching on, which is what we're doing today.
We're going to start with a poll question that should be up on your screens now. We're going to start with asking you about what is it you're hoping to get from this session? So, are you just trying to get a sense of what preservation is about? Are you looking to make sure you're on the right track? What is it that you are looking to get out of today? And with most people having voted, 33% are looking for insight about what preservation is all about. 44% are looking for some pointers on building a preservation strategy. 6% say they have a preservation requirement and are looking for some options. And 17% say they have a strategy and they're just comparing notes.
Good to know. Okay, so we thought a good place to start in a discussion about preservation would be to discuss some of the interconnected concepts that kind of get bandied around in the same breath. There are a few things that have to do with the storage and management of information, and in some cases the duplication of information, which are interrelated. And those would be backup, archiving, retention, and finally the topic of today's webinar, preservation. We often see some of these get confused with one another because they are so interconnected.
Hey, thanks very much for that, Ryan. This is Jay. I'd like to just kind of quickly talk about a little bit what we mean when we say backup, right? Because this can mean a lot of different things. The idea here really being that backup is designed to be a process for duplicating the data to allow retrieval of that duplicate set of content after a data loss event, right? But this doesn't just mean content. This also can refer to permissions, securities, metadata. This is really talking about ensuring that the actual environment that you have today, you have an offline copy of it somewhere that we can leverage in situations where you either need to restore from a critical information data loss, like natural disasters, being able to protect against theft and data loss, as well as unforeseen situations that might arise, including emergencies, right? Now, why this is important is because, as you all know, Microsoft gives you a lot of native capabilities surrounding being able to kind of do restores and retaining information, right? Things like the recycle bin having 93 days, being able to restore from a deleted email 14 days, 30 days max, version control, right? Even being able to have those kind of soft deletions for those accidental deletion requests that occurred, where you need to put something back in its entirety, but you didn't necessarily mean to remove it. All of those capabilities, they're given to you by Microsoft, but that's not their responsibility, right? Microsoft is really focused around being able to ensure that your infrastructure that's in place, all of that is actually what they want to protect. And so it's up to us as end users and customers to be able to say, we are going to secure ourselves with a third-party solution that we can now leverage in order to ensure that all of those key pieces of data and information that I was talking about previously are actually safe and available, right? So examples like this would be being able to restore from a situation where an admin executes a PowerShell script. That script now deletes all of your permissions in a SharePoint site, a site collection. There's no native way to restore just those securities. So having that third-party solution in place allows us to protect us from those one-off situations or those odd scenarios, no matter what occurs in the environment.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think a good way to summarize it would be, when disaster strikes, it's backup that you want in place in order to ensure that your information isn't lost. And that's different from archiving, which we're going to discuss next.
Right, and to add on top of this too is the on-demand element, right? Ryan and Jay, to being able to actually do this outside of the SLAs that not only Microsoft as the Azure provider gives you, but to be able to come in here when you need to be able to find and recover things on demand.
Yeah.
All right. Archive. So I'll go ahead and take this one, Ryan and Jay. So archive is definitely the next step in the evolution of the conversation between backup, a copy in a different location, and being able to take content that is not necessarily active anymore once it reaches a certain criteria. Let's say your organization has a 180-day policy that the last time a document was accessed, modified, edited, viewed, whatever criteria you guys want to use as an organization, you then take that information as a part of a flow and then put it into lower cost storage, because obviously as a part of your Microsoft agreement or any platform your organization is using for collaboration, that active storage costs more than a long-term storage like Amazon S3 or Azure Blob Storage or other workloads like that. So really what we're here to think about when it comes to archiving is content that, could be used in future, but is not necessarily active right now. Doesn't need to be in a present active workspace like a project team, a SharePoint site, OneDrive, etc., and being able to move it to another location to reduce that overall cost. That said, it's also still accessible if needed, right? So if you have a legal proceeding and you need to provide the information, or if a project comes up and they want to use some artifact from a previously completed project, being able to actually get access to that information and recover it in a timely manner is really what this is about. And that is different than a backup, which is about backing up all your content and content structure. This really focuses on giving you the ability to segment your content between active and inactive content and hold on to things for a defined period of time.
Yeah, that makes total sense, Brian. And you said something interesting the other day, which I thought was relevant, is that as soon as someone starts to think about how quickly they can get something out of archive in the event that there's a necessity, is a hint that perhaps you're thinking about backup more than you're thinking about archive. It sounds like this is really a cost-saving device for large volumes of data.
That's exactly right, because if we look at, I think you used this statistic last time, Ryan, that how much did it grow? How much did data grow over the last year? Was it something like 10 or 100 petabytes? It was a large number. I forget the exact number.
Well, it was 23% overall, so that's whatever it is, it's a large number, exactly.
So what are we doing with that content? Because we also know that most content, after it's been created and used, after about 180 days, most content is never accessed again. So what are we doing with content that is just sitting in place? And so this becomes an open discussion to drive a process around our inactive content and making retention in an archive an effective way to help segment active and inactive content. You've brought this example up before, Ryan. Do I need to see the lunch menu from 2021? Probably not, since we all work from home in one degree or another. So maybe that's something that's justifiable to archive.
Yep. Okay, and that brings us to a discussion about retention. And retention sounds like what you're doing when you're archiving, because you're retaining the information for the purposes of retrieval, perhaps as part of an e-discovery. And while it's true that there may be a portion of retention applied inside of your archive, what we're really talking about when we talk about retention is the obligation that an organization has to retain a certain piece of information or type of information according to their record schedule and according to the record series that are represented inside of that schedule. So it's more of an obligation than it is a cost-saving device.
And with this too, a lot of organizations I think struggle with retention here, Ryan and Jay. Is there a good practice or a framework that a lot of organizations should follow with retention? Because as an end user, we see this all the time. Everybody is afraid to delete anything or hold on to everything forever. But is there a good framework to talk to people about when it comes to what is a justifiable retention period?
Yeah, and a good friend of mine who is very involved in records management has a saying that says that the golden rule of records keeping is that you shouldn't keep anything, that you shouldn't delete anything before you've committed in terms of a record. So if you say you're going to keep it for 3 years, you must keep it for 3 years. And the second most important rule is you don't want to keep anything 1 day after you've been obligated to keep it, because at that stage it becomes a liability. And you're right, it's difficult to grapple with. And I think a lot of organizations are struggling because, this used to be the realm of the public sector. But more and more, it's becoming an obligation that every single organization, regardless of size or what industry they're in, has to invest into in order to get right, given the hefty fines that are being bandied around. And in many cases, you don't have to go and identify and classify every piece of information that you have. You can start with broad brushstrokes. You can start to just identify, can I differentiate between my business critical data, which normally comprises about 12% of an organization's data, and my ROT, or redundant, obsolete, and trivial information.
For sure. Well, I know we'll get more into that in some future slides.
Yeah. And that brings us to the topic of preservation. And this is something that is relatively new in the retention space. I think of it as a subset of the retention discipline. What it means is that what folks have found is that because of the pace that things move from a technological perspective, there are certain things that are risks when you're talking about retention of information over a very long period of time. There are organizations that have a 30-year retention policy for certain types of information who still have WordStar or WordPerfect or these types of documents hanging around. And so what we're talking about with preservation is how can we ensure that things that we have to keep for long periods of time can still be retrieved, can still be processed and consumed and so forth.
Right, and I think it's an important thing you put on this slide here, Ryan, that it's a combined strategy, right? It's not just put it into this bin and now we're preserving it. It's what do we need to do to justify this as a part of a policy, and being able to also make it retrievable. And then at the same time, as technology evolves, obviously we went from on-prem to now cloud, and then whatever comes next, how do we make sure that it's still accessible or that it's still findable, whatever framework we're using, 5 years down the road from now?
Yeah, exactly.
So we have another poll for y'all that is going to be popping up on your screens now. If you're comfortable, tell us a little bit about if you think you're at any risk of losing some of that important data. If you're not comfortable, there is an option for that. But if you are, we would like to know a little bit. Okay, with most people having voted, 29% say they're not sure. Another 29% say that they think they are at risk of losing some data, having heard the definitions. 36% say that they think they're good, they have a digital preservation system already in place. And 7% say they're not comfortable saying. Thanks for sharing that with us, y'all.
Okay, so what we've put together for the balance of this deck involves a few points that we think are relevant when thinking about preservation. As indicated, it's a relatively new branch of the retention discipline, and something that you'll hear a lot of buzz around in the information governance space. And without further ado, we'll list some of the things in no particular order that we would think are important if this topic is of interest to you. Okay, so the first thing to think about is the growth of information. Whatever your information governance issues are today, they're likely to be 23% or more pronounced next year. And that's based on the fact that we saw an exponential growth of information globally of 23% from last year to this year. There's another figure that goes around that says we've created more information in the last 3 or 4 years than in the rest of human history combined. And I can believe that. The quantity of information is growing exponentially, the diversity of that information is growing as well. And folks are migrating huge quantities of data to the cloud. And part of that story is the big data buzzword, where folks are trying to store as much telemetry about their business as possible in order to allow them to create analytic solutions which will arm them with the right information at the right point in time to make business decisions. And rich media like body cams and videos are becoming part of the system of record and the things that we have to manage as well. And I suppose the point we're trying to make here is that the time where we could get away with just leaving huge quantities of information that has grown organically over time on a file share somewhere, and paying the money that is required to maintain that storage and to protect that storage, that time I think is fast passing. The draconian regulations that we're seeing come out across the world in terms of the responsibilities of businesses to govern information, and also the need for folks to be able to manage certain types of information throughout its life cycle means that we really have to try and put a peg in the ground and try to get a hold of our information as soon as possible, because the problem is only going to get worse over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of those challenges, Ryan, that I see with a lot of organizations, that the IT team is tasked with this, but it's a hard discussion to have with the business, right? That every year this grows, and that, as we've mentioned with storage costs, it was initially cheap though now we're seeing a diminishing return on just extending storage unit costs versus actually taking the tough business decision to go back and start cleaning things up. And how do we go about the business and help them assuage any fears that if we delete something because it's 12 years old, that we haven't lost any valuable information to the business, right? So it's getting people to switch their mindsets that they have to constantly prune and be aware of their data growth over time as well. And I know we'll get more into that.
Yeah, the metaphor that I like is that, at a point in time, it was okay to manage a business in an informal fashion without the generally accepted accounting practices. And then that time passed, and you're expected to be able to account for every cent that goes through the business. And I think that in many ways, information is the currency of modern business, and that we're now getting to a point where we're expected to be able to account for our information, to be able to show almost in a ledger format what we have, where it sits, and what we intend to do with it.
Yeah, I'm taking that. I like that, Ryan. Currency is so information is the new currency of business. That I'm taking that. Thank you.
You're welcome to it, sir. Okay, and then why would we keep information for more than 10 years? This slide is just to talk about the line that people are drawing between preservation and the rest of the retention discipline. It seems that 10 years is the point in time that people see the most risk. If I have to keep something beyond 10 years, it's likely that that format will not be acceptable. That people talk about the difference between PDF and PDFA, where PDFs do not have fonts and those types of things embedded inside of them, and PDFA does. And as a result, a PDFA is likely to be consumable in 10 plus years, where it may not be the case for a normal PDF. These are the types of things that we're talking about. And there's a whack of them, and unlocking value to drive innovation and competitive advantage. Information is precious to us. It will probably be precious in 10 years' time. And so you would want to protect that. Mitigating risk is obviously a big one, and protecting intellectual property, licenses, patents, those have long-term storage expectations. And then maintaining records of good corporate or institutional governance. There's a lot of records that have to do with healthcare and those types of things that are expected to be kept for terms in way in excess of 10 years, and so forth. So if you understand your information landscape, I guess we're trying to say, it's likely that you'll start to realize that there are pieces of information that you want to ring fence and keep for a period longer than 10 years. And you certainly want to make sure that it's consumable by anyone who comes to use that value after 10 years. I can only imagine the frustration if you've borne the storage costs of keeping a block of information for 15 years, and someone finally goes back to consume it after 15 years of that information being an expense, only to find that the format is no longer usable. And those are the types of horror stories that happen all too often.
Absolutely. And to build on this too, right, Ryan, it's about the immediacy of accessibility, that people know where things are in a folder structure or in a particular document library, and being able to help people find things over time too, as you shift or migrate things to other workloads, or even, for example, putting a little bit of pressure on the business to help you understand and discern what is valuable information we need to keep that you need to find and retrieve quickly versus something we can even segment to longer term storage. And that can be a tough business discussion to have, but it's an important one because most IT teams have no context for why something's being kept around. And it's something that we have to have that open conversation with the business and the different business units that are creating and generating this content, because we don't need to hold on to everything forever, but we have to have some justification from the business as to why these things are being held on to. Just like we do seasonal cleaning at home, the same thing should be considered for data.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I can think of one anecdotal example of a customer that we recently assisted in migrating their information to the cloud. And as part of that effort, we performed an analysis at the outset to understand the type of information that needed to be moved across. And 2/3 of the information was not usable or useful, but it was more than 20 years old. Wow. And those types of things are commonplace, I think, depending on the type of organization. And to think that that now, as part of a cloud migration 20 years down the line, to now recognize that, you know, all of the pots and pans in the back of the cupboard that you've been storing all this time are actually not useful and need to be thrown out. That's pretty sad.
Well said, sir.
Is digital content really so fragile? I suppose the answer is yes. I suppose the answer is also that things are getting better. You know, at a point in time, it was difficult because you had to worry about tape corruption and, you know, media corruption over time, and you had to have backups of backups. And one of the things that the cloud brings us is a level of redundancy as far as our information is concerned, and a lack of an alleviation, I suppose, of the need to be concerned about whether or not you will be able to retrieve your information in a disaster event. I know that Microsoft data centers, from a Microsoft 365 perspective, for instance, each data center keeps 3 copies of each file locally. And then there's a backup data center or a regional failover where another 3 copies of the file are also kept. So that's essentially, if there is a hardware failure, you no longer have to worry about the fact that that data is going to be corrupted. Which is not to say that you shouldn't back up your data. As we said, and as Jay pointed out, it's quite possible that as part of an admin fault, information can accidentally be deleted or corrupted, and these types of things mean that you would want to be able to retrieve certain information, and that backup is certainly the way to go to do that. Besides that, things can be tampered with, and I think we've seen a lot of these types of things. You know, something as innocent as a template for a proposal, and someone goes in and actually puts all of their information into the template, and now the template is no longer generalized anymore. These are the types of things that can corrupt digital content if it's not properly versioned and it's not properly managed. File formats evolve, which we've spoken about, and there's some good examples on a later slide of some of the formats that have come and gone that some of the folks on the call might recognize. And then software versioning has accelerated. So if you are maintaining a particular type of data format that is managed by a vendor who has a CAD application, for instance, they're under no obligation to give you backwards compatibility. And in many cases globally, there are occasions where a vendor will go out of business, or a vendor will advance the software to a new version, and previous versions will become incompatible. And these are the risks that we're talking about when we talk about preservation. And just to follow on from that, there's very little governance that says that that vendors are obligated to maintain their backwards compatibility over a period of time.
Yeah, I think we've all been in this situation before, Ryan, because I know I worked help desk calls before where we had to go back and support an old version of something, and having to set all of that up and get something retrieved. It's definitely something to talk to the business about. If it is critical information, holding in a format that is either sustainable, or having a process in mind for your content that you know has to be continuously active as things change, that it is continuously supported. I know we get more into this in the next slide.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Ryan.
No, go for it, please.
Oh, sure. I'll take this one. So talking about the obsolescence of technology, I mean, one of the reasons why we moved to the cloud, right, is because Microsoft is continuously updating the M365 platform. Same with, other workloads like Google or other platforms out there that people are using regularly for their content management. Of course, Microsoft does provide some backwards compatibility. Think about the .docx framework that came out in the early 2010s for compatibility with older versions of Excel, PowerPoint, Word, etc. However, one of the things that Microsoft has made clear with their investment, and why a lot of people move to the cloud, is a guaranteed support for newer things that come around. As Ryan alluded to earlier, rich text formats, videos, and other formats that were not available in the 2010s now become things that we have to consider, hold on to, CAD files, etc. How do we go about ensuring that any content we're holding onto for a period of time, if it needs to stay justifiably active, stays in a format that is still accessible? And then how do we even, for example, if we need to go back and find something and retrieve it, is it in a format that is now readable, or an immutable object type that is readable by current technologies, right? Because we see this all the time with customers who hold on to things in a particular format, and even listed on this page with Lotus 1, 2, 3, WordStar, WordPerfect. We talk to customers all the time in the migration world who are moving off these old platforms, and the trade-offs between the conversion of some of these old platforms, especially something like Lotus Notes, which has, wiki pages or their equivalent of wiki pages, and how that can be converted to the Microsoft framework after that. Right. So thinking about these things, if you're going to be supporting older technology that is business critical, how do we ensure continued support, or the trade-off of upgrading it to a new platform, because these new platforms like M365 and Google are continuously updated by their providers, so that way the newest bits of information can be accessible, while at the same time supporting older things, but not forever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, MP3 has become MP4. AVIs
Yes.
are not as popular as they used to be. Imagine having all of your security footage in an obsolete video format and having to reprocess it in order to get it into a modern format. That could be quite an expensive process.
Exactly.
And the other thing here, just to point out, 10-year-old files may already be obsolete. And this is something that we've seen a lot of in recent years as folks start to get their information governance strategies in place because of, regulations closing in. You only realize that some of the information that you've been holding is obsolete when you actually try to access it. And that means that we should try to plan ahead and try to ensure that whatever we are storing today with the intention of unlocking it at a much later future date, that we should be sure the formats that we're using to save things in make sense. Okay, and then just a list of some other media considerations, perhaps just to help jog everyone on the webinar today's thoughts about what type of information we may be storing that we should be considering in terms of their ability to retrieve. Now, audio visual, we've spoken about. Websites, if we go from Web 1 to Web 2 to Web 3, XML becomes JSON. There's a lot of updates that happen to web formats as well. And in a lot of cases, the information is being stored in a web format for later retrieval. Emails we know about. We've got quite a number of migrations that we've done recently from older email platforms where folks have got email archives that are a decade old. These are things to think about as well. PDFs we spoke about, CAD drawings, again, blueprints and digital blueprints of buildings perhaps should be retrievable in 20 years' time. Graphics and photos we've touched on. GIS maps, something to think about. And things like project plans, projects, the project software that we use to create these plans in some cases can become obsolete, and retrieving those project plans in the event of litigation, for instance, to show the progression of work on an older project can be difficult if that format is no longer supported.
Right, or what I'm also talking to some customers about is like the evolution of a framework like Google Maps, or how exactly, information that is layered or text rich, that if things do change over time, how do we hold on to that information as a snapshot over that period of time? So even for live applications like Google Maps or other platforms like that, how do we go about making sure that any of this historical information is retrievable or as a part of a records management framework? These things are definitely living documents to a degree in some of these apps and platforms we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay, and then what we're seeing evolve as we continue to expedite engagements that have to do with information governance in our consulting world is that there's an evolving and generally accepted life cycle for information. And at a point in time, that life cycle was broken up into the world of collaboration and the world of retention, and information governance practices that records managers and compliance officers would apply to information would happen inside of a particular system. It would be aligned with a record schedule, and it would be in line with the generally accepted record keeping practices that are expected in highly regulated industries, for instance. On the collaboration side of things, it was generally the Wild West, and folks wanted to produce information quickly. They weren't really concerned about where it was stored, how it was stored, or the initial first few stages of that information lifecycle. And what we're seeing now is that there's an expectation that information should be properly classified, properly managed, right from the outset through to its disposition. And here you can see an example of some of the stages that we're seeing evolve. And essentially what's happening is folks who didn't care about information governance, your everyday employee and your IT manager, those types of things, are all having to expand their responsibilities and become more due diligent in the way that they handle information. And we see this in the way that organizations are applying training with regards to managing information in such a way that you're not susceptible to phishing, or understanding the difference between privacy relevant information and stuff that is not PII. This means that folks, the general person who is an information worker, has to become better at managing information. And at the same time, folks who generally had a siloed view of where their responsibility started as a compliance officer or records management records manager, have to expand their view and start to try to manage information right from the moment that it's created. And so these phases, there's an authoring phase where folks who are not yet comfortable with evolving information in the cloud may still be creating content on their laptops and getting to a point where they feel comfortable to share that information. That would be the collaboration space. And here we are seeing an evolution of co-authoring and techniques for evolving documents with multiple authors at the same time, and being able to share that information and having the right policies applied at the right time to mean that the right folks are able to share and access information, even if they're not part of your organization, but that access will be revoked and managed in such a way that it's not a risk to the business. There is disaster recovery, which we've spoken about. At the time that collaboration is happening, and this could be an extended period of time. It could be that some information at the end of a project is centralized for reuse. You want to have a disaster recovery mechanism on top of your collaboration space. We spoke about archiving. Information will reach a point where the likelihood of it being needed regularly is low, and yet you would still want to maintain the value having created that knowledge. And so an archiving solution will help you to do that in a low-cost format so that it's still retrievable. We spoke about retention. In other words, having the ability to apply policies to content so that it cannot be destroyed and that it will be retained according to the company's retention schedule and its obligations to global regulation or industry-specific regulations. And then there's that preservation, which is the topic of today's talk. And this is then going an extra step and saying, well, if we're going to keep this for a long period of time, let's be clever about the format we store it in and how we do it. And let's take out insurance policies to ensure that we are actually able to retain that and retrieve that information. And finally, all information should go through a process of disposition where it's destroyed. And as we said, that process should be a controlled process. We should know when we want to destroy different types of information. And in order to do that, we really have to know what type of information we have right from the outset.
Yeah, Ryan, this slide really sews together everything we've been talking about so far. And I really, really like this slide and how it bundles these aspects together, because the way I look at this as well is each one of these is a strategic framework that an organization should be considering, and then the tactical outcomes of how they're meeting this particular element, such as authoring or collaboration, what platforms are we using to collaborate? Is it email? Is it Google? Is it file shares? Is it SharePoint? Is it Teams? What are we using to do that? And then at the same time, what platforms are we using to help with ensure disaster recovery if something goes wrong? And then what those policies and procedures are, or even how the IT team is talking to the business about these areas and why it matters. Because to build on this as well, as you mentioned, is good collaboration hygiene or good content hygiene also requires some time and input from your end users and their own responsibility in this role to help us understand what is critical information, and helping the end user understand their responsibility and what tools they have at their disposal to help the organization recognize valuable information that does justify holding on to it for a longer period of time. Because that's another thing too that we always struggle with, is that a lot of organizations have their end users go back to content from years ago, and they think, well, I might need this, rather than at the time understanding that it may be a lower or a mid-level priority to hold on to for a longer period of time. So being that advocate to your organization and say, help us keep this platform clean and organized in an orderly way, think about giving yourselves time to help organize these things and make that a regular part of everybody's habit. Just like, after you work out, you may go take a shower. It's the same thing with your content. How do we make sure that after we're done working on something, that everything is maintained in a hygienic manner, but then at the same time that we can also make it presentable to others as well over the time that it needs to be held on to, or even if it needs to be retrieved for something that's particularly valuable to the business, or to build upon an historical artifact that allows us to build on top of something that we worked on previously. Because I also know, especially a lot in the Fed Civ space, that a lot of organizations, even the private sector, rely on historical information to prove out, especially to future proposals, that they've done something and that they succeeded in a previous project. So that information can be valuable, but we need the business to help us drive that, but at the same time provide the strategic framework that's laid out here and help an organization build business processes around all of these. Then at the same time build in change, as we've been talking to so far, around these elements along the way, because the one thing that does not happen anymore in the cloud is almost nothing sits still. So we have to think about and review these probably at minimum on an annual basis to make sure that our tools and strategies align with how the business actually functions.
I love that, and I love the idea of thinking about it as informational hygiene. I think it's my turn to steal a concept from you.
Good stuff.
Okay, and then some thoughts around requirements for end-to-end lifecycle management, following on from the slide that we just finished on. A cloud-based policy management system is something that organizations should invest in if they're looking to get to a point where they can manage their information to the level that we're talking about. And what we mean here is that Microsoft 365 has generalized policies that you can apply to information. They try to get the baseline right, I suppose is the best way to put it, and to have really good mechanisms that work for most organizations, but they're not going to have the granularities of policy customization and the ability to tailor it that most organizations will need to really get a granular policy in place. And so there's some really fantastic products out there for cloud-based policy management. Having worked with Brian with AvePoint and the folks that come from your organization, I can recommend that your cloud records, cloud policy, cloud governance solution, get the name right, which I've used before. Those are the types of things that we're really talking about putting in place here to ensure that the IT department doesn't have a lot of manual admin in order to manage access and manage information, etc.
Exactly. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No hassle. And then information automation and workflow system. So if you've got good policies, you probably will recognize that there is a need for information to move and to evolve and to be able to have approvals done on them, those types of things. Having a good information automation and workflow system is important, and investing into building workflows out with something like Power Automate is a good approach to this. Cloud backup system we spoke about. I think that the organizations that I have worked with who have lost information at a grand scale, where they thought that just because cloud is resilient would mean that they would be able to retrieve information in the event of, accidentally, corrupting a whole bunch of files through a PowerShell script, is definitely a pain point you don't want to have to live with. We spoke about cloud archiving solutions and reducing costs. And it's amazing to me how a lot of organizations, first of all, have a let's keep everything policy. We know information is basically an asset or could be an asset, and we don't really know how to organize it or to grapple with it. And so we'll just keep everything. But then also let's continue to carry the expense of having all of this information in highly available, responsive storage, where we could reduce our storage bill by significant amounts if we understood how to age our information into more cost-effective storage over time.
So real quick, Ryan, one thing I wanted to add here is a lot of this can feel overwhelming to a lot of IT administrators or teams trying to implement these aspects. One thing I will emphasize here is a lot of people make the mistake of missing the forest through the trees here, that they're so focused on item level control, when really a better place to start is at the workspace level, be that a drive or a file share, a SharePoint site, a team, etc. If you're looking for ways to help segment and find where your business critical data is, starting at the item level is a very tough way to do it with how fragmented things are, not only for permissions, not only for how users arbitrarily organize things, not only for naming convention issues or even what is considered valuable, because that's really colloquial to the end user and how they collaborate. But starting at a workspace level is a great way for you to start sift and organize the information and start putting the onus on the business units and business owners out there for that line of business application information. So if you're trying to, sift and find your business critical data, that's a great way to start. And the applications like you brought up, like cloud governance or even our cloud backup solutions, can do a very good job at helping you sift and find this information. So that way you're not trying to, proverbially speaking, swallow the elephant whole, you're actually eating it bit by bit. So that's one thing to really consider here when it even comes to preservation of content, is really starting at the workspace level or using some of the out-of-the-box functionality like what Microsoft 365 allows you to do can be a good starting place, because otherwise it can feel very overwhelming to a lot of customers who are starting this out or mid-journey and are finding some of the scope creep issues a little scary. So thinking about it that way can be a really effective way to reconsider or help you right the ship when it comes to the preservation concepts here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as you said, just being able to paint in broad brushstrokes, useful versus non-useful, working documents versus end product. These are the kinds of things that you can do to kind of bucket information, rather than go document by document and figure it out. And as you say, in a lot of cases, you'll find that the workspace has a lot of bearing on the usefulness of information. Right, and then cloud record solutions. A lot of folks don't realize that they're already licensed to be able to do things like retention inside of Microsoft 365. If they have the basic E3 license, they can do that. But there is a lot of nuance to how you structure retention of information. For instance, you wouldn't want to go and apply retention labels on information that's sitting inside of a Microsoft team, because once you've locked down that information inside the team, you can no longer go and delete the team. And so, assuming that that you would want to structure things in such a way that you can move information using those workflows that we spoke about, so that you can centralize things and apply the right retention labels in the right places, or perhaps even use a cloud record solution that allows you to use lower cost storage, so that you're getting the best of both worlds in terms of the ability to apply retention to information over a period of time in order to meet your policies, and to archive that information in such a way that you're not paying a premium for accessibility on high cost storage. And then finally, a digital preservation system. And if things are being retained for periods in excess of 10 years, and you've taken the trouble to make sure that from a format perspective, you have sufficient insurance and that it's stored in such a way that it will be retrieved, there are also things that you can do to ensure that that storage is also cost effective, and that the likelihood of having to retrieve something from a preservation system is probably even lower than from a record solution and an archiving solution.
So one thing real quick here, Ryan, is we find a lot of customers struggle with, do we do in-place records management or do we do out-of-place records management? Is that something you talk to a lot of your customers about, or what are you seeing about here in this conversation with, especially with like what Microsoft 365 is enabling these days with records retention?
Yeah, and I suppose that's kind of what I was trying to say about creating in-place records in Microsoft Teams, for instance. I think that there's no technological silver bullet when it comes to deciding between the two. I think that each organization is different, and again, it depends on the type of information you have, the type of regulations that you are obligated to meet, and how your information landscape is structured. I think that it's exciting to think that in-place records management means that you can find information that is subject to retention in the same place or in the same discovery cycle as information that is part of a working set. And modern search perhaps alleviates the need to have your records in exactly the same place. Certainly, I would say that the antiquated workflows where you would have a search in a collaboration system and then go to a totally different system in order to try and find a piece of information which might be a record rather than a working document. I think the usage scenarios are a whole bunch better. I would say that folks shouldn't get too stuck on, in-place records management is better than the latter. Rather, design your information architecture that in a way that makes sense to your organization. In a lot of cases, it's more about the principles of organization that you apply than it is some technology is going to solve the problem by rote.
Ryan, and that's actually a really good point, because that's something that we run into at AvePoint pretty frequently with our customers, right? Where they actually don't necessarily want to leverage a full retention policy with AvePoint specifically, or even with Microsoft natively. Sometimes they just want to focus on a specific subset of information, right? So they're managing their SharePoint data one way, but they have specific needs and requirements specifically around Exchange, right? So making sure that they're able to tackle those things separately as they need to, or even just to be able to kind of start to adopt a retention policy or a backup solution for one specific collaboration workspace, kind of goes back to Brian's point, right? Of making sure that it's not too complicated, it's not too scary in order to impact the business, and also that it's not going to impact your end users, right? Because at the end of the day, while this is about the business, it's also about ensuring that your end users are not necessarily being inundated with too much change, too much control, and having to manage too many different things. It's a responsibility for the organization, but it's also about making sure that everyone in the org can utilize this system appropriately and it doesn't impact the business too much.
Yeah, and I think there's cloud technologies that are helping us there. I know that Microsoft Search has evolved quite significantly in the last few years to include things like search connectors, which will give you a single pane of glass in terms of search results, even though it might be reaching out to non-Microsoft SaaS systems, as well as the M365 substrates, in order to pull that information and kind of give you a consolidated view of it. And I think that that's important when considering the fact, as you say, that you may have different needs for different types of information in terms of how you strategize your record keeping around them.
Good stuff.
Okay. All right, and then just a few more points. We wanted to talk about things to look out for or to focus on. So if a lot of what we've been talking about makes sense, and you can see some of the indicators that we've pointed out inside of your own information landscape, some of the things that you would want to make sure that you get right is safe and durable storage. to ensure that if you are looking at a lower cost storage solution for archiving, for instance, that you're not sacrificing the durability and the safety of that storage. You certainly want to continue to use cloud storage. You want to find something that's lower cost, and there's a few things that can feed into that. You certainly don't want to in the interests of finding the most cost-effective solution, hamstring your ability to get at that valuable information when it's needed. You want organized, trusted information. Again, you know, technology is a fantastic enabler. It is not a silver bullet. There is no shortcut to organizing and building an information taxonomy that everybody can trust. It will help your retrievability or discoverability of information. It will help you classify your information, apply retention at the right time, will make your automation workflows more relevant. There are just so many benefits to taking the initial step of organizing your information landscape in such a way that you're able to I suppose, build on top of that with good policy and good processes.
Yeah,
readable, useful. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, real quick on this, I was going to ask Jay to add a little bit of input here, because I know you've worked with technical support at AvePoint for some time. Are you seeing on our side some people still struggle with some of these concepts that Ryan was just speaking about? Because I know sometimes when we talk to customers about preservation versus retention versus backup, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion there still.
Absolutely. Thinking of this, you know, we had a situation kind of recently, right, where the customer was talking to us a little bit about retention labels and things like that. But when we started to kind of dive into the actual conversation, we started to realize that they didn't necessarily know whether they needed a backup solution or if they actually really just needed kind of like a cloud records archiving solution, right? So what we had to kind of uncover was whether or not this was really even live data that was actually being touched upon frequently, or if this is data that really, like, you know, you were talking about before, something that won't actually be accessed for a long period of time, right? It's really more there in case they need it. So those two different conversations come up all the time. And it really does beg the question of, we need to make sure that when we're trying to look at a retention-based solution, that we're offering the right type of tool for the right type of job, right? Because otherwise, all it can do is cause confusion and concerns when it comes time to actually accessing that content, right? Even being able to restore and put that content back becomes a real topic of concern, because being able to access something within minutes is a lot different than being able to access something from weeks and hours in a turnaround time, right? So those are definitely things that we see from a support perspective all the time.
Good stuff. Thank you. Go ahead, Ryan. I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I know we're close on time.
Yeah, that's a good anecdote, though. That makes sense. And we're seeing the same sorts of things. We spoke about wanting to have readable, usable information, and that means making sure that if you intend to keep things for a longer period of time, doing the due diligence of making sure that the format it's being stored in will be retrievable. Secure immediate access, and I suppose this speaks to what Jay was just talking about, or near immediate. In some cases, if you have a really low cost archiving solution, it's okay to have a 2-day rehydration, for instance, because it is not a backup solution. And really being able to retrieve information 2 days later is okay if you're getting significant cost savings from that type of storage. The other thing, and as you said, we're running on time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit, is wherever possible, you want to reduce human intervention. So if you're setting up your information landscape in such a way, you can have SharePoint libraries that automatically classify information. You can use content types. You can use managed metadata. These are techniques which allow you to remove the onus for classification from the actual worker. Just because I'm creating something in a specific place, when I want to interact with it, when I want to start evolving certain content, I'm automatically classifying stuff. And it's these types of mechanisms that can make these information landscapes really effective. And then finally, automated acquisition and progression of information. That life cycle that we were talking about, in all likelihood, you want things to move in order to go into a backup solution as a duplicate, in order to go into an archive for reduced costs, in order to go somewhere where it can have retention applied to it, and those policies can be maintained. And you want to try and automate the process of moving information from place to place as much as possible. Okay, next slide. Okay, so as we come up on time, and I'll hand over to Maggie to sign us off here, but we offer a free workshop. If everything that we're talking about makes sense and you'd like some help in evolving an information strategy or understanding some of the problems that you have, we'd love to meet with you and spend some time looking at your particular information environment. The 4-hour workshop is split up over a number of days. It is handled by our information governance experts and is at no cost whatsoever. We'd love to get to know a little bit more about your information journey and see how we can assist. Maggie,
Okay,
over to
and as we come to time here, one question that I'm seeing people ask is, will the slides be available? A recording will be made available around this time tomorrow, so just keep an eye on your inboxes for that, and we'll make sure to get that out to you. If you have any other questions that come up later on, feel free to email me and I will pass them along to our awesome team here. But thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate y'all taking the time out of your day, and thank you to our panelists. And hopefully we will see y'all next month. Everybody stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, team.